Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Tonight, President Trump takes aim at one of America's biggest trading partners.
We've been taken advantage of for many, many years by countries, both friend and foe. And frankly, the friends have been worse than the foes in many cases. Keep working. It's all going to work out.
Now threatening Canada with a new 35% tariff that would take effect next month, along with new tariffs against dozens of other countries. We're going to bring you inside the negotiations when we talk ahead to White House trade advisor Peter Navarro, who's also accusing Fed Chair Jay Powell of blocking President Trump's economic agenda.
And the president visits the disaster-torn region in Texas, where more than 170 people are still missing after catastrophic floods, with questions swirling around emergency preparedness and response. We'll discuss with former Texas Land Commissioner George P. Bush.
Plus, President Trump promising a major statement on Russia coming next week as Moscow continues attacks on Ukrainian civilians, and a major sanctions package standing by on Capitol Hill.
Sanctions have never changed Mr. Putin's approach to the battlefield, and that's the most important thing we need to do now.
We'll discuss the potential impact of those sanctions and how a new weapons agreement with NATO allies could help with former Democratic Congresswoman Jane Harman ahead.
And as Congress considers the White House's rescissions bill, President Trump issues another threat to Republicans. Give the cuts your support or risk losing his. But we begin this evening with the president's latest tariff threats. And joining us live for more right here in our Washington bureau is Peter Navarro, White House Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio, Peter. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it was great to be with you and Joe.
When we consider the remarks the president made to NBC yesterday, suggesting most of our trading partners could see a tariff rate of between 15 and 20% being implemented, was that the president just riffing, or should we expect that the baseline 10% rate currently in place is going to go higher?
The baseline way to think about this is to look at the original levels of reciprocal tariffs and the letters that have just gone out where the president has lifted the tariffs from the 10% to a higher rate, roughly track what the reciprocal rates were originally. Some are a little lower, some are a little higher. But the problem, Kaylee, that this country faces, and it is an urgent national emergency, is we run this massive trade deficit every year. Cumulatively, it's been like $18 trillion of deficits over the last several decades. And that represents a transfer of our wealth abroad. It represents a transfer of our factories and our jobs. So the process now for investors, I think, is working quite well. People talk a lot about uncertainty, this kind of thing like that. I think it's pretty clear where we're going. It's an ongoing negotiation. We've had every major country in the world and a lot of smaller ones come to us, and they're fully engaged in negotiations. We're getting to a place, but what we're learning is that the more a country takes advantage of us, the less willing they are to give up the good thing they got going. So that's the tension. But the president is not going to tolerate that. So that's where we're at. I would say that for the American people, these tariffs are a great boon. I brought a chart here. It shows that we've already collected like $100 billion of tariffs.
A record for
alone.
a single fiscal year.
Yeah, and one of the things that really bothers me is that we're up to 18 billion now or so with China alone on the fentanyl tariffs. And so they're willing to give us $18 billion in tariffs, and they still won't do what they promised back in 2019 directly from the president of China, which is to stop killing Americans. So the tariffs are working, and they were these kind of revenues that we're getting. It's a very important part of the big, beautiful bill in terms of financing that as well. So we've got an external revenue service that's going to augment the internal revenue service. And we're moving for a structural reset of the international trading environment, which by any measure is skewed against us.
When you talk about killing Americans, you're referring to fentanyl here, right?
I'm referring to fentanyl.
Because you spoke passionately about fentanyl, the scourge of fentanyl, last time you joined us,
yes.
specific to Canada and Mexico at that point.
And,
also China.
Well, China, yeah.
But with Canada now with a 35% tariff threat, I'm just wondering, as a point of clarification, because I can see what you're pursuing here, and you've made the case for this. Sure. Does that come with a USMCA carve-out?
Yes,
Would that be extended to Mexico as well?
No, the 35% tariff is not on USMCA.
Got it.
Okay.
Even beyond the 1st of August.
I mean, let's talk candidly about Canada. I think going back to, again, President Trump's first term, I remember in the very first days of the administration, Bob Lighthizer, Wilbur Ross, myself, were negotiating directly with the Canadians, many of whom are still in charge of their trade policy. And we were negotiating with both the Mexicans and the Canadians, and the Mexicans were a pure joy to deal with. You know, they were tough negotiators, but they were reasonable, fair negotiators. The Canadians were very, very difficult, and they've always been very difficult. And I think what the Canadian leadership needs to understand, as opposed to the Canadian people, which we love, is that this waving this big bat of retaliation at the United States of America, I mean, no, they shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. They just don't have the weight in terms of any advantage they might have at us. So I would just urge Canada to the Canadian citizens to urge their leaders to negotiate fairly with us, because, look, every country that we're negotiating with, it's just a fact. They have higher tariffs than we do. They have bigger non-tariff barriers. And we run these massive trade deficits with many of them. How does that happen if trade's fair? It doesn't. So that's all. President Trump, going back to the 80s, has promised to correct this.
Well, and of course, it's not just about country by country. It's also sector by sector. The president suggested this week that we could see a 200% tariff on pharmaceuticals, for example, but that could be on a longer time horizon, a year plus out, to allow supply chains time to reorient themselves toward the United States. Could we see a similar delay in other sectors that there's Section 232 investigations into, like semiconductors, for example?
Well, let's talk about the Section 232, because there are a number of different ways that the president has the legal authority to raise tariffs. Section 232 basically goes on the presumption that if imports are basically putting American capacity out of business in a way which harms the United States, he has the right to offset that. So whether it's steel and aluminum, or whether it's copper, where we just made a major announcement on that, or whether it's pharmaceuticals, the end game for the 232 tariffs is to strengthen our defense industrial base, our manufacturing base, and in the case of pharmaceuticals, our health industrial base. Again, as a veteran of the first Trump term, I was the guy, the Defense Production Act policy coordinator, who was in charge of getting all the medicines and the PPE and getting the vaccine thing jump-started and all of that. And we learned some very harsh lessons there. Certainly, there was just incredible rhetoric from China at one point where they were going to drown us in a sea of virus and withhold things from us if we dared say that the virus was from the Wuhan lab. I mean, that's out there. Just go look at that. But it was also true that every one of our allies, when push came to shove, they weren't with us. And so it was every nation on their own. So we learned pharmaceuticals are particularly critical to have onshore for national security purposes.
I want to get to Jay Powell with you, and I'm going to try to do it this way, because I heard you talking recently about the big, beautiful bill that the president just signed into law. There have been questions about whether it adds to deficit and debt, and you have said just the opposite, that combined with tariff revenues, you will turn $2 to $3 trillion in deficit spending to a $2 to $3 trillion surplus. Yeah. That would be a big deal. Can you do that without Jay Powell cutting interest rates?
Well, we can do it without Jay Powell cutting interest rates, because the numbers are so overwhelming. Okay,
because you said he's blocking your agenda.
But Powell, I mean, let's not conflate those two. Let me talk first about the big, beautiful bill economics. It's fairly straightforward. The way it works is there's this thing called the Congressional Budget Office.
We talk about it a lot already.
When you do a bill like that, it's the CBO that does the official forecast.
Sure. And you want dynamic
and
scoring.
Historically, they've just been far more wrong than right, dating back to the first term. And so all you got to know about the CBO forecast this time around is that it assumes a 1.8 rate of economic growth, which we think is way too low. And from that 1.8, and they don't put in any dynamic effects to speak of, and when they try to do that, they screwed that up to whatever. They came up with a $2 to $3 trillion increase in the debt. Okay, it's like, no, wait a minute. Here's what you're not doing. Two things. One is that if you simply increase the growth rate by 1%, like we did in the first term, CBO got it wrong same way in the first term, you raise a couple of $1 trillion of that, so you get almost to zero, okay, you get to neutrality. They didn't count the tariff revenues, and that's like, that's a trillion or more.
Because they're coming from the executive branch, not from Congress. They can't, technically.
Oh, but they should have counted it because it counts towards the debt. I mean, look at it, $100 billion in, I don't know, the first 6 months. We're gonna have a situation where if you simply do the numbers right for the big beautiful bill, it's a significant reduction in the debt. And what that'll do, if you want to segue to Jay Powell, what that'll do is it'll actually lower yields and interest rates because we'll have to finance less. Now, with respect to Powell, I think there's a strong argument that can be made that he's at least 50 basis points above where he should be, and we should be in a place where we should be 50 basis points lower now, moving towards even lower. And let's just deconstruct what 50 basis points too high means. That's about a quarter to a half point of GDP growth reduction. And that, in turn, means about 500,000 to 750,000 fewer jobs that we'll create because of Jay Powell. It's a couple of $100 billion in lost output, and there's billions lost in tax revenues. Then when you go from there, and I was watching Lael, I'm sure you have Lael Brainerd.
Yes.
I saw her on another network yesterday, and she has no clue. It's like she was talking about the big, beautiful bill and Powell and all this stuff, but 20 to 30% of our debt is financed by short-term debt. That's the way they roll that. So if you look at a half point more on the short-term debt, that's a couple $100 billion that you build into the debt over 10 years. That's real money. Mortgage rates, average family, $400,000 30-year mortgage, that's over $1,000 a year. And then we got this last point, $1 trillion of revolving credit card debt. That's about $5 billion more that consumers pay. So, this idea of what's wrong with waiting? Now, I'll tell you what's wrong with waiting, all those costs, and what's wrong with lowering them now. And if you get it wrong and inflation heats up, just put it in reverse. We used to do that. Fed policy used to be uncertain by design to keep the bond market and everybody else with discipline. We've got this like weird concept now where we got to telegraph a year in advance what that is. And it doesn't work.
But with the bond market, it's not so much the Fed funds rate. It's the bond market that dictates things like mortgage rates and overall borrowing costs. Is there a risk that public pressure on the Fed chairman when he does cut then creates a credibility problem for the Fed? The bond market no longer trusts the Fed, and you still run into these same problems with higher rates.
I don't think there's any risk at all of that. I think the bond market, frankly, thinks Jerome Powell's a clown at this point because of what he did. And I can go over the three major mistakes he makes, but the bond market will do what the bond market does, seeing the data. And when you see 10-year yields going down significantly like they have been doing, that should tell Jerome Powell that the short-run rates should be coming down significantly. And that's not happening. And let me just, on the Powell thing, let's be clear. It's like this op-ed I had in The Hill basically looked at all the Fed chairmen we've had over the last, 40 years and ranked them. Who was good, who was bad.
He's in a race to be the worst.
And there's an argument that he was the worst. And if you look at, like, Arthur Burns, 72, helps Nixon get reelected, sets off the stagflation.
Yeah.
G. William Miller is in the middle of that mix, sits on his hands. He was the other lawyer in the mix besides Powell, totally unqualified.
You went through Greenspan, Bernanke,
you had
fast forward to Powell.
Greenspan not understanding how the .com was going to bring productivity and allow you to go forward without inflation.
Yeah.
But Powell has made three major blunders. In first term, he raised rates too fast. He was like too early, Powell. And that's been documented by the Fed itself. He made a mistake.
Right. Then you
in the second term, this is what, and you folks were right here on this set, and I wonder why you might not have been asking about Jay Powell. Hey, Jay, are you going to say anything about all these bills they're passing contributing to inflation? Jay, why are you waiting to raise interest rates?
His job is monetary policy, not fiscal policy.
No. Actually, I'll give you my favorite Fed chair besides Paul Volcker, William McChesney Martin. Most famous quote in Fed history is, job of the Fed chair is to take the punch bowl away before the party gets too good, right? And what McChesney Martin did, which was so profound, when Lyndon Johnson was prosecuting the Vietnam War and refusing to trade off guns for butter, McChesney Martin started raising rates. And LBJ demarched him down to his ranch and tried to read him the Riot Act, and Martin said, no, you got to choose one or the other. And so Powell should have said a lot during that time. He didn't, and one of the reasons was he wanted to be reappointed to the Fed. He's a political animal. Let's be clear about that.
They're wrapping me. This is the longest interview we've ever done on this show. I want you to know, Peter Navarro.
All right, let's give a hand to Kaylee here.
Let's absolutely hear it for Kaylee. Do you want to fire Philip Swagel or Jay Powell before we go, or is it both?
I don't fire anybody. I just report the facts here. And I just love coming to your studios.
Well, let's keep this conversation going. We appreciate you coming over from the White House today. And
we'll have another baby on the planet
That's right.
when I come back.
It's a wonderful thing.
Congratulations.
Absolutely. White House Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing, Peter Navarro, we thank you so much for being with us on Bloomberg.
Now, Joe, we turn to another subject as we consider the president's visit today to Kerrville, Texas, of course, the area that was devastated by flooding last weekend with more than 120 people killed, some 170 still missing. And we want to get the latest now on that story on Bloomberg TV and radio as we turn to Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief, Julie Fine. Julie, thank you for joining us live from Dallas. We, of course, saw the president taking part in a roundtable with local officials, other statewide officials in Texas. What have we learned and what happens next after Air Force One departs again?
Well, it was interesting because he came right out and said they're going to need an alarm system on the rivers here in Texas. Obviously, that has been a major source of discussion. Texas legislature will meet in a week. They will sit down. They will begin hammering that out. The question, of course, you can talk about funding all the way, federal, state, local. How are they going to go about funding it? I believe that will come next. And while the president is leaving Texas, he met with families. He saw the devastation firsthand. He did have to answer questions about funding, when he said he believes that FEMA was there. They were on the ground quickly. Now you're looking at pictures of him right now meeting with families, with the governor there with him. And, they were very, when they spoke about meeting with the families, they said the families were very important to them, as was the state of Texas. As you know, state of Texas has done very well for Governor Abbott politically. But again, once he leaves, you can see that mass destruction right there behind him. This is going to take some time to build an area that is home to many camps, but it has an economy of its own, 55,000 people. That tough work will begin by the Texas legislature in a week, and they will have to figure out exactly how to pay for this. Joe and Kaylee.
Appreciate the help here, Julie Fine. Thank you so much. Bloomberg's Texas Bureau Chief on the case for us. For more on the president's visit today and the damage caused by these deadly Texas floods and what needs to be done next, we turn to George P. Bush, the former commissioner of the Texas General Land Office. Commissioner Bush, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's good to see you. Everyone's been an expert on response and rescue operations over the past couple of days. I'm wondering what Texans actually want, the extent to which they want the government to be involved here, enhancing infrastructure for early warning.
Well, I suspect that on July 21, when the special session gavels back in, that the legislature will go back to the bill that was administered this past session, but was unsuccessful. It was a $500 million package to create an early detection and warning system with respect to a state that unfortunately is subject to the most amount of natural disasters than any other state in America. People forget since 1980, our state has had more federal declarations than any other state, and it ranges from flash floods, such as the one that we've seen in Kerrville, to devastating storms like Hurricane Harvey, which I happen to preside over as the land commissioner, leading the state's largest housing recovery, and I think it was the second largest in American history behind Katrina. This storm is nothing short of devastating, but as you know, politicians typically respond after the fact instead of preparing before the devastating events. But we need to focus on the positives here. I believe legislators will reconvene past that $500 million package that will implement early communication and warning systems along the Guadalupe, similar to what was done in the Wimberley storms from 2016, where the Blanco River Authority did set aside the dollars to create that early detection system that can mitigate lives. That we need to prepare better for these storms.
Well, when we consider the preparation, and you speak to some of the recent natural disasters that the state of Texas has experienced, does it also need to be better adaptation and mitigation to what is a changing environment?
Absolutely. When I was land commissioner, I advocated for the largest storm surge barrier in American history. After Katrina, New Orleans and Louisiana were successful in obtaining a federal appropriation to create two swinging levees that now largely protect New Orleans from a devastating Category 3+ storms. In fact, they've had a few storms, and this system has actually worked. It's been accomplished before in American history, and we can do it again as Texans, whether it's flash floods or devastating storms that could hit the Galveston area. But I'm a big believer, if you look at the economics of natural disasters and the recovery, it's so much cheaper at the federal level to allow states, counties, and cities to come forward to the federal government with well thought out plans that are NEPA compliant and working with the U.S. Corps of Engineers to help mitigate those future storms, because believe it or not, our climate is changing. And violent storms like this will continue happening. So we can choose one path, which is to respond and ask taxpayers from other parts of the country to fund it, or we can come together as a country and put together those plans and better prepare and develop that infrastructure beforehand.
Stories like these, unfortunately, have a way of falling off the front page pretty quickly, Commissioner Bush. Once that's the case and we're on to other things and whatever the crisis of the day may be in politics, what will be happening on the ground in Texas? How long will it take to clean this up?
I mean, I'm hearing estimates of several months, if not years. I mean, going back to the experience at Hurricane Harvey, we were cleaning debris for over a year, obtaining federal waivers and permits to allow us to just burn the trash. I remember an estimate that every single landfill in the state of Texas was inundated with debris. And if you look at just these images that are occurring on the Guadalupe River, and if you can visualize a wall of water of in excess of 30 feet and all the debris that are along the Balcones Escarpment along that way, this is going to take a long time. But as a former leader in Texas, I can tell you that the people of Texas are so resilient and strong. There are tens of thousands of volunteers, including my church, Riverbend, which is on the ground in a church in Kerrville, helping people respond and getting badly needed supplies. And what's crazy about this, Joe, is that there are still over 100 people missing. I mean, we are still in the search and rescue aspect of what's occurring here, and it's been a week. So recovery is never easy. Unfortunately, we're already pointing fingers at one another. But first things first, we got to save lives.
That is absolutely true. We should keep that in mind. Before we let you go, Commissioner, we just have a minute left here. But if a state like Texas, with its size and capacity, still needs the support of the federal government to respond to a disaster like this, what does it tell you about changes that should or should not be made to FEMA?
I've long been an advocate for reorganizing FEMA and consolidating the disaster recovery components of what it does, along with the numerous other federal agencies, in Washington, D.C. that respond to disasters to make it simple, cut through the bureaucratic red tape for local, county, and statewide officials. Just one quick example from Hurricane Harvey: to rebuild a home, it required over 16 permits from different agencies under NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. And if we can just cut through the red tape, you essentially block grant the dollars down to the states, counties, and cities to allow them to adjudicate the recovery process. I assure you that most states are going to do it better than the federal government. There are certain jurisdictions that don't have that experience like we do in Texas, but there's a lot that we can do at the federal level.
All right, George P. Bush, former commissioner of Texas General Land Office, thank you so much for joining us. And still ahead, we'll have the threat President Trump is issuing to Republicans as they consider his $9 billion rescissions package. But up first, we'll talk about the ongoing war in Ukraine with Jane Harman next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I really believe that we should continue the sanctions because they are having some effect on Russia, on the Russian people, on the Russian economy. But sanctions have never changed Mr. Putin's approach to the battlefield. And that's the most important thing we need to do now. We need to change his approach to the battlefield.
Retired four-star general for the U.S. Air Force and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Philip Breedlove, here on Balance of Power last night, discussing the efficacy of sanctions against Russia. This as President Trump says he plans to make a, quote, major statement about Russia this Monday. And joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio for more is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. So, Wendy, we obviously don't know what exactly this statement might entail, but we do know that the president has also suggested this notion that the sanctions package in the Senate, spearheaded by Lindsey Graham, may be something that moves forward. Could they be related?
Absolutely, they could be. I mean, and remember, this is a rare these days, completely bipartisan bill. It's not only Democrat Richard Blumenthal is also big on this, and this is a bill that could just sail through. It's a moment where everyone agrees. So Donald Trump is now apparently happy with the language in the bill about what wiggle room it gives him on sanctions and when to impose them and all of that. So if that works out, that could be the big announcement. We know that he's also very irritated right now with Vladimir Putin. Or it could be, this could also be a lot of Donald Trump hype, and it's just that it's something that we already know, that weapons to Ukraine are now flowing again, or, something like that it could be. But it very well could be related to the sanctions bill, given the Senate comes back next week.
If this has been rewritten or tweaks for President Trump to have total purview over the use of these sanctions, what's the point of going to Congress? Why not just announce the sanctions at the Treasury Department? Well,
I'm not sure it gives him total say, Joe, but it will give him some wiggle room to decide when and how much, depending on that. Donald Trump has proven that, he sees Congress as sort of a, unnecessary impediment to the things he's getting done.
That's why he's not a king.
That's right, exactly. But Lindsey Graham has sort of convinced him that it would work better for him domestically and internationally if he had Congress behind them. Plus, let's not forget, the Constitution does give them the power of the purse.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
We don't always remember that around here lately. Wendy, it's great having you back. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with us live in Washington as President Trump promises a major statement on Russia Monday. Earlier today, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky provided this update in an address to the nation. He said, quote, according to all reports, the supply has been renewed. We will continue to work with the American side at the military level, in particular our military with General Keith Kellogg, unquote. He's referring to the resumption of weapons shipments from the U.S. And we're joined now live by Jane Harman, former Democratic Congresswoman from California, who was ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee. Jane, it's great to have you back. You most recently, of course, served as chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, and we're always glad to have you as part of our conversation. Now that the weapons are flowing again, this at some point is going to run out, they say, likely by the end of the summer. I'm curious what happens next, because these were all approved in the Biden administration. What happens when they run out, when the weather gets cold?
Well, let me say a few things about this, Joe. First of all, we sadly have a transactional foreign policy. there's not a strategy behind this because President Trump was against it before he was for it, and he was against the Graham-Blumenthal bill before. Now he may let it go through, et cetera, et cetera. What we really need is a strategy around helping Ukraine win a war against an aggressor which violated international law and invaded it 3 years ago. I was critical of the Biden administration for slow-rolling weapons, and I am critical of the Trump administration for letting what seems like rogue elements in the Pentagon disrupt the flow of patriots, which are the critical asset that can protect Ukraine's cities, which are under bombardment from hundreds of drones every single night. So I'm glad that's being restored. When you're asking me what happens when the aid package runs out, Congress needs to act. And the good news is that Congress is actually moving this Graham-Blumenthal bill, which has a veto-proof majority supporting it, over 80 senators out of 100. That is astonishing in these times. And what it would do, I think the Graham bill matters. It will impose crippling sanctions, secondary sanctions, on any countries that trade in fuel and energy with Russia. And that will really hurt Russia's economy and get Putin's attention in a way that sort of softer sanctions haven't. So it's the combo of weapons, defensive weapons, but also permission to Ukraine to attack targets in Russia that are targeting it, plus sanctions.
But when we talk, Jane, about the threat of potentially more crippling sanctions, of more weapons going to Ukraine, those things do not yet seem to be deterring Vladimir Putin at all or changing his behavior. In fact, what we're seeing is intensifying strikes on civilian targets in Ukraine. So what signal is Vladimir Putin receiving from the United States, and does it match the one that you think the U.S. is trying to send?
No, because he's watched Trump. He plays Trump very well, and he has played every U.S. president since 1994 when he agreed that he would recognize Ukraine's sovereignty if Ukraine gave up its nukes. He's violated that, and there have been lots of presidents in both parties since, so let's go there. But I think he doesn't really believe the administration will be tough. I think if the Graham-Blumenthal bill passes, I think if Congress extends a serious aid package to Ukraine, he'll have to believe it. And I also think China has its own issues, and China has been the big aid to Russia. Let's see. But I think Putin could soon discover that he's in between a rock and a hard place, and he better be more serious about the U.S. View of Ukraine.
Well, in the meantime, he continues to bomb Ukrainian civilians. It was a brutal night again in Kyiv with people hiding in bomb shelters. You could hear the sound of missiles and low-flying drones for hours through sections of the capital. Jane, this is not somebody who seems to be moved easily. Is there anything Donald Trump could say on Monday that would stop this?
Yeah, I think if he said, I'm all for the Graham bill, it's going to be implemented, I will sign it the minute it passes both houses of Congress, and they can be quick to do things like this when they are motivated. Yeah. And if he says, not only am I sending patriots, but I'm doubling whatever other aid is necessary and on an emergency basis and asking Congress for a big appropriation, I think that will that work? I hope so. I think Putin smells a vacuum right this minute and is doing everything he can to damage Ukraine's cities and its will. But I have said forever that the strongest weapon in this war is the Ukrainian heart, and they're never going to give up, and they shouldn't give up. And don't we understand that NATO is next? We are members of NATO. I don't think President Trump, no matter what some people are whispering, is going to pull out of NATO or even pull out of our Article 5 obligations for common defense. I don't think that will happen. I don't think Congress will let that happen. And so I think this is Putin's last stand. I surely hope it is. And I hope what comes next is a settlement on Ukraine's terms to this unfair, cruel, ridiculous, unlawful war.
Well, as we talk about the prospect of one war ending, I'd like to ask you about another, Jane, and of course that's the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, as the administration is suggesting we could reach a ceasefire agreement in the coming days. We heard this from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, at a summit in Kuala Lumpur earlier, talking about that.
Well, we're hopeful. I mean, in the end, we're hoping they'll move to proximity talks. It appears that generally the terms have been agreed to, but obviously now you need to have talks about how you implement those terms. And I spoke to Steve Woodcock last night, and he's optimistic that proximity talks will begin fairly soon, expedited and facilitated by the Qataris and the Egyptians.
Jane, as you well know, we've been told that a deal was close before. It's happened repeatedly, and yet deals have not always materialized. Is this time different to you?
Well, let's start with the fact that a ceasefire is not a long-term strategy. It is at least an end of the killing for a period of time, and in the case of Gaza, maybe an exchange of 10 hostages for a number of Palestinian prisoners. There are 20 hostages still alive, reportedly, so there's still 10 to go. But then what? Bibi is, so far as we know, opposed to a state for the Palestinians or a pathway to a state. He wants 5 million Palestinians, 2 million in Gaza and 3 million in the West Bank, to choose where they want to live. Well, what if they choose to live where they live in a state with responsible government? How about that idea? And the same thing is true for Iran. I mean, there's a ceasefire as a predicate to what? How are we going to resolve differences in Israel, too, with Iran? I can't imagine, after watching what is happening to Ukraine, which gave up its nukes in 1994, that Iran is going to want to give up its nukes. It hasn't reached breakout yet, but it's almost nukes in exchange for some countries, not the U.S., I assume, but some countries violating its sovereignty in the future.
So what's more likely, a ceasefire with Hamas or another Israeli strike against Iran?
A parade of horribles. I think a ceasefire with Hamas is the most likely at the moment. I don't know about actions against Iran. If there's evidence claimed by Israel that Iran is proceeding to make a bomb, which it could possibly do, I think the strikes by Israel and our strike have not totally eradicated, or the word is, obliterated Iran's nuclear possibilities. So it may have pushed them to move faster. So there could be more strikes. I somehow don't think that's on the Trump playlist for the moment. I don't think so. There was so much pushback here. It was so unpopular, but it probably is on the Bibi playlist.
All right, Jane Harman, chair of the Commission on National Defense Strategy, formerly, and of course, former Democratic Congresswoman from California. Thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, President Trump's warning to Senate Republicans: support my $9 billion rescissions package or lose my endorsement. We'll have more when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And here are some of the top stories we're following in today's Power Brief. The New York Times reports that veteran Washington insider David Gergen has died. He joined the Nixon White House in 1971 and went on to work for 3 more administrations: Presidents Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton. He was later well known as a political commentator on television. Gergen's son told the New York Times that the cause of death was dementia. He was 83 years old.
The State Department began laying off 1,300 U.S.-based employees today, a result of the recent Supreme Court ruling that allowed the Trump administration to move forward with plans to slash the size of the overall federal workforce. According to a document reviewed by Bloomberg News, employees notified by email will be placed on immediate administrative leave. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the reorganization in April, which is ultimately expected to result in roughly 3,000 people leaving the agency.
And Congress has 1 week to get a $9.4 billion rescissions package to President Trump's desk. Senate Republicans could technically pass it along party lines, but Democrats are threatening to upend the government funding process if they do, which could lead to a shutdown. Several Senate Republicans have raised concern over the package, including cuts to HIV/AIDS prevention and public broadcasting. Last night, the president issued this threat on Truth Social, quote, "Any Republican that votes to allow this monstrosity to continue broadcasting will not have my support or endorsement." And this morning, Russ Vought, director of the Office of Management and Budget, had this to say.
We have our first rescissions package up on Congress. We had a great vote in the House. We have a second vote next week. I am confident that they will pass the bill. We think it's a very important step for Congress to show that they are willing to pass the DOGE cuts. People say, why is it a $9 billion package? It's a $9 billion package because we want to see, is Congress serious about that?
Which brings us to this evening's political panel. Joining us with their reaction to this and more, Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. It's great to see you both here. Rick, we've been talking about rescissions all week. Will they or won't they? Is this threat from Donald Trump enough to get it over the finish line?
You know, when you think about the people who would be involved in that threat, Susan Collins, she doesn't currently have a primary opponent. I can't imagine there's anybody who would challenge her, who would have a chance at beating her in a primary. So I think they look at that with some skepticism. Maybe that works in the House of Representatives where finding primary opponents isn't that hard to do. Doing it against a sitting United States senator who's a chairman of a appropriations committee, totally different. But that being said, there is a desire by this, Congress to give the president what he wants. And yet it's also tying their hands to saying, basically, we're giving a large chunk of our authorizing and appropriating role to the White House. And they've been stripped of a lot of power so far this year. Do they want to go down that aisle, too? And it has nothing to do with the policies that are espoused in the $9 billion cuts.
Well, when we consider the idea that you could cut this $9 billion, or Jeannie, if this is going to be an example, you could cut another $9 billion or more than that down the line that Congress agrees to appropriate. So that is why Democrats are asking, well, why would we make an appropriations deal with Republicans? Is this all ultimately going to end up in a government shutdown this fall?
Yeah, it absolutely could. I mean, I'm thinking that the odds of a shutdown at this point are creeping higher and higher, which is, of course, unfortunate. I just want to step back a minute and say that if we took some kind of secret poll of the Republicans in Congress, I bet you they are missing a Democratic president more than ever. They were just strong-armed on the reconciliation bill. They're being strong-armed again on the rescission bill. To Rick's point, we don't know if it will work. But turns out you may be happier as a congressman if the president is from the other party, if you're facing a re-election bid or you are up in the next cycle. And, for Democrats, this is going to be very, very tough. But I don't think there is much incentive to work with Republicans if everything they pass can be clawed back so easily by the president and doesn't have to be subject to the filibuster.
So the old line item veto may be coming back, Rick Davis. If that happens, are you rolling your eyes at talk of a shutdown? Is it too soon to have this conversation or what?
Well, that assumes that you have an appropriations process, right? And we've talked quite a bit about whether or not you're going to go through these appropriations bills.
As promised.
Which require 60 votes, and that's the hang up with what Jeannie's saying, or just do a continuing resolution. Right. And getting a party line 51 votes for a continuing resolution will be a snap. And so that takes care of any discussion of a government shutdown. We'd love to see appropriations bills, regular order. I have to say it. It's a Friday.
Dare to dream.
Dare to dream, although my dreams have been dashed. And yet there was a way to fund government. It's not the best way to do it. And part of the reason that members want to do it in regular orders, then they get their earmarks. I mean, we're back in the earmark era again. Right. And so you don't get that with a continuing resolution. So they're torn a lot of different ways in the Senate right now as to, how to go, because they know if they vote for this rescissions bill, they're not going to get an appropriations bill. But if they don't get the appropriations bill, they lose their earmarks.
So it's a no-win situation is what you're saying, Rick Davis.
Well, based on this, if you're a member of Congress and you don't care about rescissions, there's a path forward. Yeah. But if you walk the plank and do what the president says and vote for these rescissions, the rest of it's going to happen on a continuing resolution.
Which,
you've made that vote already.
A lot of Republicans in the House have an allergy to. We've seen a lot of continuing resolutions. Jeannie, if that's how this ends, do we start talking about the future career path of Mike Johnson? Again, what's Chip Roy going to say about that?
Yeah, we could. And let's all hope they don't break poor Rick Davis's heart by not using regular order. That would be so unfortunate. We don't want to see that. Yeah, for these Republicans, they are looking at 2026, particularly in the House, all of them. They have to go back to their districts. They still have to sell this reconciliation. So all of these things matter. And you know who else is looking at 2026 is Donald Trump. It is his last election, so we think. His legacy is on the line. He desperately does not want to lose the House and face 2 years of impeachment threats. And so I think for all his threats, he's to the legislators to go with him on this. He's going to have to be very, very careful because it is in those purple districts that they will keep the House and thus keep his legacy. So I think this gets a little bit more complicated when we think about it in the context of 2026. But if history is any guide, especially recent, they will bow to his threats at some point. I think what likely happens is the Senate will, make some changes and then probably jam the House, which is what we're used to at this point.
Didn't we just go through that with the One Big Beautiful Bill?
Familiar.
The Senate made some changes, the House made a lot of noise, and then the House ultimately passed the bill. So it'll be interesting to see if history repeats itself. But Jeannie, in the event that it does not, when we consider this particular executive branch of government under not just the leadership of President Trump, of course, but the likes of Russ Vought over at the OMB. What if they don't get the rescissions they want from Congress? How do you actually expect them to respond? Do you think that there could still be a fight over whether or not they can execute these rescissions, irrespective of congressional appropriators, ultimately a testing of the boundaries here?
Oh, I absolutely think. I mean, if we know one thing about this White House, and nobody is better schooled at trying to move these things forward than Russ Vought. I mean, he is very good at this process. They are not going to take no's for an answer. So if they can't get it one way, they will certainly look for other opportunities to do that. And this is, of course, important to the president, these cuts, and also the administration and many in Congress, because they talked an awful lot about these DOGE cuts. And so while they have lost some touch with Elon Musk of late, these DOGE cuts matter to them. And so I do think if it doesn't work one way, they're going to seek alternative paths to get this done.
The idea has been, at least recently, though, that nothing else is coming out of this Congress now that the president's big, beautiful bill has passed. Outside of this rescissions plan, does the president have an agenda, or we're on to the midterms now?
Yeah, I think the budget is still a lively issue. I mean, committees are going through the appropriations process. That typically devours all the extra time that is needed in the Senate. But I would say, you spoke to Jane Harman earlier on the program. Yeah. This sanctions bill could be the biggest thing that happens for the balance of the year. Okay. And so, we're watching it very strong in the Senate as to whether or not they can trigger a vote before they get out for August recess, which would clearly send a message to Putin that the U.S. is not, getting backtracked on their support for Ukraine. So this is the toughest sanctions bill that the Senate will have ever passed. And so I think a lot of people are looking at that going, OK, let's get it out of the Senate and get moving into the House of Representatives. So before the fall, President can sign it into law.
Well, passing a sanctions bill is one thing, Jeannie. I don't know what you think about the probability of that happening. Passing more funding for Ukraine, which would also be required of Congress if that is to materialize, is another. Do you think the latter is as likely as the former?
Yeah, I do think that depending on what we hear from the president next week, and we think we'll hear something about this situation, that it is likely they would be able to get some partisan support, as we've seen in the past, for passing support for weapons. And of course, the sanctions, when you look at the impact on the ground, these secondary sanctions, as full-throated as they are likely not nearly as important as giving Ukraine what it needs to defend itself. And so I think that is the more important of the two if they're both lined up there. But of course, we've got a long way to go on that.
We're out of time here, Rick. We've got just about a minute left. Did Donald Trump do the right thing by going to Texas today? Was it the right time?
Absolutely. This is what American public think their president should do. It's part of what brings the country together, especially in these really horrific crises that exist, for instance, in Kerrville today with the president. So I think he did the right thing, and I'm glad he spent the time he did with the people there.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our political panel on this Friday. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us as we head into the weekend. And if you're looking for a little weekend reading. Make sure to check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll meet you back here Monday when we're, going to have a major announcement. There could be a lot of news to talk about, in fact. Have a great weekend and meet us back here on Balance of Power Monday. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.